Okay, so the responses were kind of split here. The question, what is a feature that makes cardiac muscle different from skeletal muscle? So A says it has no striations, so that's incorrect. We know that they both have striations. B says it has a parallel sarcomere structure. They both have parallel sarcomere structures that give them the striations. So A and B are sort of tied together and are features that are shared with cardiac and smooth muscle. C says its contractions are not regulated by the troponin, tropomyosin system. That we know is also a shared feature, all right? So A, B, and C are shared properties between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. They've got striations that are arranged in parallel sarcomeres, and they are regulated, contractions, by troponin and tropomyosin. D says it is extensively connected by gap junctions, okay? Gap junctions is only seen in cardiac muscle. It's not something that we spoke about, not something that is encountered in skeletal muscle at all. Okay, can anyone remember what type of smooth muscle also has gap junctions? Just a bit of a recall question here from smooth muscle. So what type of smooth muscle, multi-unit or a single unit, was also associated with gap junctions? Okay, so I'm not seeing a response, but it would have been the single unit smooth muscle. This is what allowed that muscle to act as a single unit, the communication via the gap junctions, okay? So the answer here would have been extensively connected by gap junctions, which is a property only seen in cardiac muscle, not seen in skeletal. All right, one more teaser question here. Okay, last 10 seconds. All right, so lots of response for D, and D is absolutely correct. So what is the primary purpose of the cardiovascular system? To bring oxygen and nutrients to cells, true. To remove cellular waste, so cellular waste removal, also true. And hormone transportation, also true. So if you think about cardiovascular, so cardio is the heart, vascular is the circulatory component there. So that is the entire system that we're speaking about here. And so it's not just about the pumping of that blood, but also the circulation of that blood, sending important things to tissues, clearing waste away, and then moving other things around, clotting factors, hormones, etc. Okay, so the answer here would have been D. All of these are equally important functions of the cardiovascular system. All right, and as I mentioned before, we're going to start here with the heart part of it, and then in ANP2, we're going to pick up with the vasculature, the blood, and so on. So our first objective is to have a general understanding of the components that make up the cardiovascular system. In essence, what are the structures, right? The vessels, the heart, the valves, the chambers. So really an introduction to the functional anatomy of the cardiovascular system. So the players are the heart itself, and the heart we know is this muscular pump. It's got 4 chambers, which I'll touch on in a minute. So it can receive blood into 2 of those chambers, and then it can eject blood from 2 of those chambers as well. It's got vessels, so blood vessels, the arteries that are circulating blood to different structures, tissues, and cells. There are veins that are bringing blood back to the heart from those structures, tissues, and cells. And then the third component is going to be the actual blood. So the component that's actually circulating in the vessels, that is transporting oxygen, nutrients, hormones, all that good stuff to our tissues, and then removing waste, so carbon dioxide, metabolic byproducts, removing that to be either detoxified in the liver or actually just to be eliminated from the body, such as the case with the CO2 being removed at the level of the lungs. Okay, so it has an important function in transport, right? So sending things around, removing waste, and then also trafficking things. So proteins, immune cells, white blood cells, red blood cells, clotting factors, all of those things are circulated using the blood as a highway, if you will, right? So there's some means for them to be circulated around the body. Okay, we're going to start off by just looking at an overview of the heart, and I'll kind of talk about the chambers here, and then we'll add some more details as we go along. So what we're looking at here is kind of a cross section, and this is for reference, the section that we're taking. So we've kind of sliced off a part of the 4 chambers so that we can get a nice view at each of those chambers, the internal aspect of each of those chambers. So we've got our ventricles, and the ventricles are these lower chambers. They are larger in terms of the space that they can occupy. They're also larger in terms of the thickness of the wall, especially the left ventricle. And I'll keep pointing this out, but the left ventricle has more resistance to work against, and so that muscle has more work to do, and so it usually is larger than the wall of the ventricle on the right. So here's our left ventricle, here's our right ventricle, and the ventricles are our ejection chambers. They're our pumping chambers. These are the chambers that blood leaves before it can go back out into the vasculature. Contrasting that to our atria are on top. So here is the right atrium, here is the slightly smaller left atrium, and these are the receiving chambers. So on either side, they're receiving blood either from the pulmonary circulation, which is the case with the left atrium, or receiving blood from the general circulation, blood that's coming back from the entire body, which is the case on the right side, the right atrium. Okay, and so this is how the heart kind of receives blood and ejects that blood and makes it a pump, essentially moving the blood around, continually circulating it through the entire body. Okay. Let's talk about some of the vessels, and let's actually walk ourselves through how this blood moves around the system and comes back to the heart. So we start out with our our main vessel, which is the aorta. So from the left ventricle, lots of pressure here being exerted on the blood and squeezing it out into this first branch, which is the aorta, right? It goes over here, starts distributing blood to these smaller vessels, up to the head and neck, up to the upper extremities, and then it curves backward and descends down through the thorax and abdomen, where it can give blood to the lower extremities, the abdominal region, and so on. So this is the main route that blood takes from the pump, the heart, out to our distal vasculature. From there, it's going to go into veins as it's going to go into capillary beds, rather, to exchange those nutrients and waste products. Then it's going to go into veins, and then it's all going to converge into the main vein, which is the inferior vena cava. The inferior vena cava is going to come back to the heart from the inferior perspective, and then the superior vena cava is going to come back to the heart from the superior perspective. So the inferior vena cava is draining blood from our abdomen, lower extremities, back into the right side of the heart. The superior vena cava is draining blood from our upper extremities, head and neck, and also back into the right side of the heart, the right atrium. From there, blood goes from the right atrium to the right ventricle, so it goes from the atria to the ventricle, so from a receiving chamber to a pumping chamber, and then from there, it is again ejected. So again, this really thick muscle of the ventricular wall lets us know the type of work that this chamber has to do. It has to squeeze, to contract, to provide the force to eject that blood, just like we saw on the left side. So it's going to eject that blood into the pulmonary artery. This is where blood goes to the lungs. So it goes into that main pulmonary trunk that splits off into right and left pulmonary arteries, and that is going to right and left lungs, respectively. This is how we can reoxygenate that blood, and we can lose the waste products such as carbon dioxide and have that exchange across the lungs. So from there, we exchange, we lose waste, pick up more oxygen from the lungs, and then we go into the pulmonary veins, which are bringing that freshly oxygenated blood from the lungs back into the left atrium, and then that can be circulated once again to the left ventricle and out to our entire body again and again. Okay, so that is a general overview of the circulatory system and how the heart's kind of just sitting in the middle, serving as a pump on both sides for circulating that blood through the general circulation, but also through the pulmonary circulation. So here is just a little bit of a GIF, just showing you what that looks like in movement. So blood's going from atria, coming back from the lungs, down into the ventricle, ejected into the aorta, makes its way through the systemic circulation, all the way back into the large veins, into the right atrium, down into the right ventricle, up into the pulmonary aorta, back to the lungs, where we can exchange once again and get fresh oxygen to be circulated again. Okay. Now there are valves present, and I'll touch on the details of the valves going forward, but separating these chambers and preventing any backflow, keeping the blood moving in one unidirectional fashion, we do have valves that help to maintain that. So in between atria and ventricle, we have AV valves or atrioventricular valves, and these are separately named on both sides. We'll talk about that going forward. And then in between the ventricle and the exiting vessel, so between the ventricle and the aorta is the aortic valve. Between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery is the pulmonic or pulmonary valve. Okay, and so we'll add on more details going forward, but the valves are really important in keeping the blood moving from one chamber to the preceding chamber, to the subsequent chamber, and not going back to the preceding chamber. All right. Here is another way of illustrating that. So this is more of a schematic representation, because we know that the heart isn't shaped like this, although we can express it in this drawing. But this is more of a schematic representation, just showing you again what that circulation looks like. It's much clearer here to show you how blood is moving through in this fashion. So we go from our left atrium to our left ventricle into our systemic arteries via the aorta. We go all the way into arteries, smaller branches of those arteries called arterioles, and then we get to the site of our capillary beds. Capillaries are the smallest vessels, and they're really thin because they allow for diffusion of the things that we spoke about. So oxygen can diffuse right across that capillary bed into the tissues. CO2 can diffuse in the opposite direction. So from the tissues back into the capillaries so that it can be circulated to the heart and then eventually to the lungs. So then we go into our venules, our smaller veins, then into our larger veins, then into the inferior and superior vena cava, which dump back into the right atrium. And then from the right atrium, we go to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, we go back out again into the pulmonary artery, which takes us to the lungs. From the lungs, we can lose that CO2 that we picked up down here. So we picked up CO2 down here, we lost oxygen down here, and at the level of the lungs, the reverse is true. We're picking up fresh oxygen and we're losing that CO2. That's how we exhale CO2 physically through the process of ventilation. Right? From there, we've got fresh oxygenated blood. Once again, we've lost that CO2 that we picked up, and we can send that circulating through the system once again. And so that gives us two general systems of circulation. We've got the pulmonary circulation, which is going from right ventricle to pulmonary artery, to the lungs, to pulmonary veins, back into the left atrium. Then we've got the systemic circulation that goes from the left ventricle out to the tissues and capillary beds, back into the right atrium, and all that is considered our general circulation or our systemic circulation. All right. Let's talk about some of the branching that our arteries and arterioles do, and some of the sequence of flow of structures from the heart all the way back to the heart once again. So we start out from the heart and then we go into our main vessels, which are arteries. Arteries are large branching vessels. They're generally taking blood away from the heart. And so the description and the definition of an artery has less to do with what is present inside of it. So arteries usually have oxygenated blood, but there are instances that I'm going to talk about where an artery has deoxygenated blood. And so the true definition of an artery is a vessel that is taking blood away from the heart, right? The direction of flow with respect to the heart. We then get into arterioles, which are slightly smaller arteries. This is where we have more branching. We have more resistance here because we have thicker walls to these vessels. And from there, we get into capillaries. So our smallest branch to the vasculature is going to be capillaries. This is where we have really thin vessels. This is where we see that exchange happening between the blood and the tissues. And then we can communicate into venules, or smaller veins that converge into veins. And then from veins, we can go into the heart, the right side of the heart. Now, this is a closed system. And by closed system, we mean that this is not leaving the system at any point. So the blood that is circulating in the heart goes to the arteries, to the arterioles, to the capillaries, to the venules, to the veins, back to the heart, and it never leaves that system of circulation. There is never an opportunity to introduce any new blood, right, to that system, unless we have an intravenous type of introduction, or there is a tear to the vasculature. Unless there's something abnormal, this is just a closed loop. So the blood is going to continually flow around and around, encountering all of these structures, and then making its way around back to the heart. Now, just to go back here and talk a little bit about what I mean by the true definition of an artery. So when we look at, let's actually go here. When we look at this vessel, it's shown here in blue because it has deoxygenated blood. So blood that has been picked up from our capillary beds, circulated back to the right side of the heart, down to the right ventricle, and now out into the pulmonary artery, it is still deoxygenated. It doesn't have oxygen or as much oxygen, and it has CO2. We still consider it an artery because it is moving away from the heart, okay? An alternate example of this is going to be the pulmonary veins. So these are in red, and veins usually have deoxygenated blood, but in this instance, these veins are coming back to the heart, and so they're bringing back freshly oxygenated blood. And while this is oxygenated, we're going to still consider these vessels to be veins because their direction is toward the heart. So the true definition of an artery is its direction going away from the heart. A true definition of a vein is its direction coming back toward the heart, and not so much the level of oxygen that is found inside the blood. All right. Okay, let's talk about the blood composition here. So blood is one of those components of the cardiovascular system. This is the actual transport mechanism for our substances through the vessels. And let's talk about the composition of what makes up our blood. So our blood is about 45% erythrocytes, okay? So half of it is actually water, half of it is actually cells. Of the half that is cells, 45% of that cellular component is erythrocytes, which are our red blood cells. These are the transport cells that help to mobilize oxygen and CO2 inside the blood. Okay, a smaller component of the cells are going to be leukocytes, which are our white blood cells. These help to defend the body against pathogens. And platelets. Platelets are non-cellular fragments. So they don't have a nucleus. They're not actually cells in and of themselves, but they are cellular fragments. So one large cell that kind of lysed and erupted into these smaller fragments that provide clotting for our blood and help to heal, or to correct, or to clot at the site of vessel injury, and are really important in preventing us from losing excess blood. So platelets and leukocytes together make a much smaller component of the cellular part of blood. That's about 1% of our blood. Okay, and then the rest of that, about 55% of that is plasma. So just fluid, the watery part of blood. It's got water in there, it's got some solutes, it's got electrolytes, it's got our ions like sodium and potassium and chloride. And that is going to be about 55% of our total blood volume. So about half of that is just water. Okay, and so just to kind of, translate that to this drawing here, we've got the watery component on top. We've got the cellular component on the bottom, and then we've got the buffy coat, which is really formed by leukocytes and platelets that are not a part of the erythrocytes, so the red blood part of our blood, essentially. And then the rest of that is going to be our actual cellular red blood cells, so erythrocytes, which form about 45% of our total blood volume. And the way that we find this out, by the way, is to centrifuge. If you've ever worked in a clinical setting, I'm sure you've seen this happen, but you take a vial of blood that you draw from someone, from their veins, you put it into a machine that allows it to spin very, very quickly. That's called centrifuge. And that allows the components to separate out by density. And so that's how we can actually tell what the watery component is, what the cellular component is, and the way that those different components separate out by their density. So the cells are going to actually sink to the bottom, whereas the fluid component actually floats up to the top.